Welcome to In the Hot Seat with the Tenney Group. I'm Spencer Tenney. It's good to be with you. Got a great guest today, Todd Reiser, Senior Vice President of the Transportation Practice at the Lockton Companies. Todd, welcome, sir.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here. Spencer, appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity. Always good to connect with you all and look forward to spending some time today.
Well, same here. So before we heat things up a little bit, just tell us a little bit about the Lockton Companies and what you're doing for your team there out in Kansas City.
Sure. So Lockton is a family-owned, privately owned insurance brokerage and risk management firm based in Kansas City. Been around since the late 60s. We're the largest family-owned insurance broker in the world. Maintain a global presence now in I think 40 countries, but still maintain obviously a family-owned feel. I specialize here in our transportation practice. I've been here 22 years now. I'm an attorney by background, but I've been in the transportation insurance practice for that entire period of time. I spend most of our time with larger, more sophisticated motor carriers, and it's really been a wild ride the last few years. So glad to be here, and always a pleasure.
Well, thank you for that. And with that, let's jump right in. Now, you and I, quick chat before we got on live here about just the trends in the insurance market over the last couple of years. So just kind of brief, high-level overview. What's changed, let's say, between 2020 to where we are today in terms of the insurance trends?
Sure. I think, in 2020, we were right in the teeth of the market being really in a free fall as far as hardening goes. We were especially all of the commercial auto liability marketplace, but especially the excess liability marketplace was just in kind of a disastrous period. We were seeing increases in the, 100, 200, 300% increase from a rate perspective, even on risks that had no loss activity. So we were in an extremely hard period of time. A number of carriers made difficult decisions as far as buying less excess limit. Some carriers, made the decision to buy no excess coverage, certainly, especially the smaller and middle-sized carriers out there. And a number of the large carriers took their limits down substantially. So that was really a period where it was sort of batten down the hatches and try to survive and really understand how we could best mitigate these cost increases. And to where we are now compared to then, I think the market has substantially calmed, if you will. It's certainly not soft. We're certainly not seeing rate reductions, but we are seeing, a much less of an extreme increase from a rate perspective, looking more sort of in the high single digit, low double digit type increases. As you move up the excess tower, those increases kind of are remaining more stable. So, I think as you talk to our clients and others in the industry, and also, the industry has sort of gotten a little bit more accustomed to where the market is now. So there's not as many surprises. People sort of understand and are well out in advance of things from a renewal perspective. I think on the auto liability side, from a primary perspective, insurance companies are still looking to get rate. If you read any of the results from the auto liability insurers out there, they all talk about still being having combined ratios north of 100, so they're losing money. Rates still aren't adequate. The tort environment and the litigiousness of our industry faces right now. Litigiousness our industry faces right now certainly is still creating concern, and the underwriters are still looking for rate, but it has stabilized quite a bit. As far as the other lines of coverage go, we'll talk a little bit later, I think, but there's certainly some other hot button areas right now, including cyber liability, which we'll talk about maybe in a little bit here, but that's a very difficult line of coverage right now. We've seen a lot of trucking companies face ransomware attacks in the last year. Read about them, it seems like every other week. One area that's remained relatively stable has been workers' compensation. Workers' compensation has been probably the one area where we have not seen a lot of rate pressure over the past couple of years, and that currently, it remains that way from a work comp perspective. So I would just say generally the market has calmed down to a degree, but it's still fairly difficult.
Well, I think that's reassuring and probably what most people expected. But I'm really interested. You kind of teased in terms of some of the newer risk in the market that are top of mind for some folks. So, from your vantage point, what do you see both in terms of 2022, but maybe even in 23, 24? What are the evolving risks that are influencing the way that we insure trucking transportation companies?
Well, I think there's a number of areas. Certainly, as I mentioned, cyber liability. I mean, 5 years ago, cyber liability policies were sort of an afterthought. You fill out an application and you went out and bought what was relatively cheap coverage. And fast forward to now, as I mentioned earlier, you see, ransomware attacks facing trucking companies, on a much too frequent basis. And it's not just a transportation issue; it's across the entire cyber insurance marketplace. We've just seen so many, whether it be cyber attacks, ransomware, et cetera, and it's become extremely difficult to secure cyber coverage. And those companies that are able to secure it have to have pretty substantial controls in place. So we've had to have some tough conversations with clients and customers about their IT programs, the security features, what kind of multi-factor authorization they have in place, and companies have had to make some pretty substantial improvements to their IT programs just to afford themselves the opportunity to get coverage. If you don't have certain features or certain attributes of the IT program from a security perspective, it simply isn't available. And then a lot of the coverage that's out there also now has some pretty significant exclusions when it comes to ransomware. So that's something that certainly trucking companies are facing, and obviously a lot of the larger trucking companies out there are really having to take a hard look at their cyber program. The other thing out there that's, it isn't here, I would say, from a widespread perspective, but it's certainly on the forefront of what a lot of people are talking about is autonomous trucks. Obviously the technology exists right now, and there are a number of examples of companies out there that are operating autonomous trucks, not necessarily on a geographically widespread basis, but we all know the technology's here, and it's really just going to be interesting how the insurance community responds, to that, because it's a unique question. I mean, you start talking about software and hardware and the lack of potentially a driver, and where does that liability sit? Does that liability sit with the software maker? Does it sit with the hardware companies? Does it sit with the OEM? So there, and it's a shift from a liability perspective. Whereas before it was the truck driver, or the trucking company. So adds a couple layers of complexity. But I also have a number of contacts in that industry, and I know that the technology is just amazing, and it's very robust. And I mean, as you can read any day now, there are trips being taken all across the country by autonomous trucks in a controlled environment. So I think it's just a matter of time before that becomes something that's pretty prevalent. So those are a couple areas that are sort of on the forefront these days.
So let me just follow up on that for a moment. When it comes to the autonomous trucks, the questions that, especially from an M&A standpoint, people are asking us, like, okay, when's that going to be available? How's it going to affect mergers and acquisitions? And I say, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. But I sense that some of that, in terms of when it's actually real and when it's kind of become normalized within our industry, some of that has to do with when insurance gets comfortable.
Yeah, 100%.
So how do you see that timeline, and in what way do you think the insurance market will influence that timeline?
It kind of remains to be seen. I mean, of course, there's the regulatory side of things. And so, until the DOT was to, completely authorize the use of autonomous trucks with no driver, with no safety driver in the cab, we won't be facing that. As I mentioned, I think the technology is certainly there now. The insurance industry has really, is certainly looking at it. All the large commercial auto insurers have, I would say, focus groups and folks internally that are, from an underwriting and actuarial perspective, are kind of looking at the risk. We haven't had any, to my knowledge, at least any of our major commercial auto insurers come out with a set position as to, here's what our time frame is, or here's how we would insure these types of vehicles versus how we traditionally have insured the motor carrier industry. Um, but all of them have, I think folks looking at that with anticipation that it's going to be coming around the corner. I mean, and I don't have a good feel for exactly when the time frame. I don't think anybody does. But we all know that it's not going to be so much the technology. It's going to be, to your point, the insurance industry, the regulatory environment, whether the general public is ready for, a truck that doesn't have a driver in it, because the perception of that versus the reality of it is quite different, as you no doubt can imagine.
So, transitioning to another topic, had the privilege of attending one of Lockton Companies' summits a while back, which a tremendous event. You guys are first class. You have a lot of great clients. I'm curious. You've been there 22 years. Have seen some of the best when it comes of first in class of safety and risk programs within trucking companies. What are some of the characteristics of what we maybe you might call these the Patrick Mahomes of insurance and safety programs? And so, what are some of those characteristics? And in 2022, maybe not so much last year or 5 years ago. Today, what are the characteristics that are really separating some from the rest?
Yeah, I think there's the obvious influx of technology that's come on over the past years, and there's been a lot of discussion about it, and it's certainly prevalent around our industry, whether it be the collision mitigation, collision avoidance, whether it be cameras, all of the various types of technology that are available now on the truck. And obviously, a lot of the best in class operators out there are well down the road as far as implementing those types of technologies. So I mean, if you're in a situation right now where you're a large motor carrier and you're considering whether or not you ought to have some of these types of safety technologies implemented in your fleet, you're a little bit behind. And a lot of the best in class carriers out there have are fully implemented with collision mitigation, fully implemented with, for sure, at least some degree of outward facing cameras. Undercarriage, getting under the truck, with the barriers on the sides, or the mirror technology with cameras, and a lot of it now is artificial intelligence, as far as an AI learning system that's not just a camera looking at the driver, but really a whole system that's looking at the driver's behavior and alerting the driver in real time. And then, it's one thing to have a lot of that technology, but the other thing that the best in class carriers do is they spend a lot of time and money and resource to understand the data. They're not just capturing the data, but they're collecting it and using it to train and educate the drivers. So they're using it not just, oh, I've got a camera, so therefore I might get exonerated in this accident if it wasn't my fault, but I'm using the fact that the driver had a couple of issues or had a couple hard stops or what have you, and we're going back to that driver and his asset manager or fleet manager and having an education as to how we can make that driver better. And the data is really there as far as the impact that has on accidents. And so I think, that is really where, the cutting edge fleets, they've already been spending so much time internally understanding the technology, implementing the technology, staffing up to have that technology and data at their fingertips. They're really out ahead as far as the industry goes, and it shows, frankly, on their results.
When we're dealing in M&A, sometimes we had a question at a panel here recently, and they were asking about risk and safety. What role does it play? Mergers and acquisitions, especially due diligence. And one of our VPs, Eric Keith, chimed in. He's like, well, what we see sometimes, unfortunately, is that you have these great policies, these great practices on paper, and then we get to due diligence, and it turns out like the execution's not really there.
Absolutely.
They look great.
Yeah,
so my question is, what are some things that either you're doing with that carriers could be doing in terms of partnership with their insurance companies to make sure that the execution is there on a consistent basis?
Yeah, that's really key. We tell people all the time, if you're going to implement a policy, and to your earlier comment, if you're going to put it in writing and have a written documented policy that we're going to try to adhere to, the worst thing you can do obviously is then not adhere to it. I mean, and from a liability perspective, if you can imagine a plaintiff's attorney holding up a safety manual or a procedural manual and saying, so this is the standard that your company is held accountable to, correct? And that's correct. And then, but you weren't held up to that standard here, and you weren't living up to that. And that's just a situation you can find yourself in that can be really damaging, So, we spend a lot of time educating our insurance companies about our clients and their practices. And, we spend time not just showing it to them or sending it to them on paper or talking about it, but, having the insurance companies really spend time at the client, at the motor carrier, meeting with the staff, meeting with their operations folks, understanding what makes them different, seeing firsthand, here's what happens from a safety perspective when we have an incident, or what happens when we have, someone send in a camera report that, gives us something that we can pick apart from a driver's perspective on a safety violation, So the underwriters, understand that there's a lot of accountability there, and that the company, realizes that if they've got a process, they've got to follow it. And so that's something, that as you get those underwriters more and more comfortable and develop that relationship longer term, it gives them a comfort level, and then it results in, obviously better underwriting results for our customers.
So you mentioned relationship. One thing that I've noticed, my family's been serving this industry for 3 generations now, such a relationship-driven industry. How has the relationship between the insurance solution professional and the business owner evolved over the last couple of years?
I think it's gotten more and more ingrained, as insurance has been, a higher cost item, a big item as far as increased cost for these motor carriers. There's a number of high quality brokers, that service the transportation industry, that really know the space. They really know, not just the insurance piece of it, but, how does the overall risk profile of the company, how do we best get that in front of the insurance community? And then how do we make that insurance community a part of that relationship? It's incumbent, I think, on the insurance professional to make sure that the entire company, not just, whether it be the legal or finance teams, but the operations teams, the executive teams, the safety teams, everybody is at the table in those discussions and are a part of those relationships with the insurance community, because, it's a partnership. You're looking for, a financial partner that's, hopefully going to be a long-term member of your team. And so it's important to bring all those constituencies to the table. It's not just a transaction like, it might have been back in the soft market back in the 90s.
Well, last question for you, a little bit of a wild card for you, Todd.
Sure.
So I want you to go back. I want you to go back 22 years ago, pre-Lockton Companies, and you're speaking to young Todd, and you're considering career options. What advice would you give to young Todd 22 years ago as he's setting out on an industry for the better part of a whole career? What advice would you give to that young man?
Well, I think it's I would tell young Todd, the most important thing, in my opinion, is just, you're going to be in this. Hopefully, you're going to be in this business for a long time. So I mean, value the relationships. Be a sponge when it comes to learning from those that have been in the business longer than you have, that you're learning from. There's a number of folks in our industry that I look up to and respect that have been in the industry longer than I have. And when I was new in the industry, I tried to spend as much time as I could just being quiet and sitting and sort of listening. And I'm not just talking about my colleagues here at Lockton, but I'm talking about folks in the insurance industry, folks in the banking industry like yourselves, folks that are attorneys and other types of advisors around the space, getting to know that entire spectrum of folks and understanding how they do things, not being overeager, but, trying to be patient as far as building relationships goes. I tell people all the time as I'm talking to them, I've been doing sort of the same thing for my entire career as far as just building these types of relationships. Some of them happen sooner than others, I've gotten to know you over the past, for sort of 5 to 7 years, I think, and those types of relationships will just continue to foster and build over time. Because at the end of the day, that 22-year period kind of flies by. And so the other advice I'd give you is just sort of don't take things too seriously. Take time to take a deep breath, enjoy the things that are really important in life, and make sure you keep that perspective that we're all doing the best we can, and take one day at a time.
Pure gold, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on the hot seat. That's going to do it for us. We'll see you next time.